Two companies, two different logics. On the left is GKN, an engineering institution founded in 1759. Yes, 1759. More than 2.5 centuries of accumulated industrial knowledge, aircraft structures, engine components, automotive systems, powder metallurgy, world-class engineering capability. On the other side is Melrose Industries, a comparatively young company built around a remarkably simple investment philosophy: buy, improve, sell. Two companies, two very different ideas of creating value. One through centuries of engineering excellence, the other through operational transformation. Why GKN became vulnerable? By 2017, GKN wasn't short of technology. It wasn't short of customers. It wasn't short of engineering talent. Its challenge was something less visible: complexity. Over decades, GKN had evolved into a large industrial portfolio: aerospace, automotive, powder metallurgy, different operating models, different supply chains, different priorities. Each business performed well individually, but coordinating them as one enterprise became increasingly difficult. Investors began seeing a familiar pattern: strong assets, weak conversion into shareholder value, profit warnings, operational inconsistency, leadership uncertainty. Notice something important: nobody questioned GKN's engineering. The question was whether the organization itself had become too difficult to optimize. Those are architectural symptoms. While Melrose saw an opportunity, Melrose looked at exactly the same company and saw something completely different. It didn't see a declining business. It saw outstanding engineering trapped inside organizational complexity. The thesis was simple: if operations could be simplified, if decisions could become faster, if performance could become more consistent, then value would emerge. That belief triggered one of Britain's largest takeover battles, the Takeover. And the acquisition itself happened remarkably quickly. The debate around it did not. Politicians became involved. Trade unions became involved. The national media became involved. People asked different questions. Was Melrose rescuing an industrial icon or dismantling one? Should a 259-year-old engineering company remain independent, or should shareholders accept immediate value? The shareholders decided, with just over 52% of the vote, that Melrose should take over. A remarkably narrow result considering the scale of what followed. What happened next? Now we arrive at the part that interests me most. Most observers assumed Melrose would simply buy GKN, improve it, and sell it. After all, that's their operational model. And initially, that's exactly what the strategy looked like: operational improvements, higher margins, cash generation, portfolio simplification. Eventually, the automotive and powder metallurgy businesses were separated into doles. Everything appeared to follow the familiar Melrose playbook, until aerospace changed the story. Aerospace doesn't behave like most industries. Engine programs last decades. Aftermarket revenues continue for decades. Risk-sharing partnerships create value over decades. Those economics reward patience for far more than rapid exits. Instead of GKN changing to fit Melrose, Melrose gradually changed itself to fit aerospace. Today, Melrose is no longer simply a turnaround specialist, but it has become fundamentally an aerospace company. In many ways, GKN Aerospace reshaped Melrose's future more than Melrose reshaped GKN's. One of the most fascinating ironies in modern industrial history. Why does this matter? Why spend time on this acquisition? Because it demonstrates something every transformation program eventually discovers. Buying a company is easy. Integrating one is very hard. Ownership transfers overnight. Capability does not. You can acquire factories, you can replace ERP systems, you can redesign processes. But aligning engineering, procurement, manufacturing, finance, suppliers, and customers into one coherent operating model, that takes years. That is the work of enterprise architecture, and that is precisely why mergers succeed or fail long after the lawyers have finished their work. Melrose didn't just acquire an aerospace business, it inherited one of the most complex engineering ecosystems in the world. The real transformation began only after the acquisition closed. The question became, how do we measure whether the transformation actually worked? And that's where we go next. In 2018, Melrose completed one of the most closely watched takeovers in British history. Around £8 billion at the time, the debate centered on ownership. Would GKN be broken? Would the key aerospace capabilities disappear? But inside the business, a different challenge had begun. How do you improve the performance of one of the world's most complex engineering enterprises? Buying a company takes months. Understanding it takes years. 2019 to 20. Almost immediately, the aerospace market entered one of the most difficult periods ever because COVID arrived. The lockdowns all over the world began. Commercial aviation slowed dramatically. Revenue fell. Cash suddenly became precious. For many companies, transformation programs were postponed. For Melrose, they became unavoidable. The organization simplified. Non-core activities were reduced. Every investment had to justify itself. Every process had to create value. 2021 to 23. The turnaround. As markets recovered, the results became increasingly visible. Margins improved, operating profit increased, cash generation strengthened. Those numbers looked financial, but are they actually operational? Behind every improvement were thousands of decisions. Factory, suppliers, engineering, procurement, program execution. The financial statements recorded the outcome. The operational excellence actually contributed towards it. Then came the decision that changed everything. Melrose separated Dowlais, allowing automotive and powder metallurgy to become independent, but it kept GKN Aerospace. Think about what that means. Melrose is famous for buying businesses, improving them, and eventually selling them. Yet when the transformation was complete, it chose to remain an aerospace company. That decision says more than any investor presentation ever could. The business that Melrose expected to exit became the business it wanted to own. Why? The answer isn't difficult to understand. Aerospace is different. Aircraft platforms remain in service for decades. Engines generate aftermarket revenue for decades. Certification creates enormous barriers to entry. Customer relationships often span generations of aircraft. This is not an industry that rewards short-term thinking. It rewards patience, consistency, operational excellence. Look at the financial performance here in 2026. Revenue recovers. Margins rise from around 5% towards 17 or 18%. Cash flow turns strongly positive. Those are excellent results. But here's the important point. Financial performance is the visible outcome. Something deeper had to change before those numbers could appear. And that raises one question. What exactly was Melrose protecting when it decided to keep GKN Aerospace? And primarily the aerospace part, aerospace capability within GKN. The factories, the technology, the aircraft programs? Partly, but I believe the real strategic asset was something much larger, the aerospace supply network. And that's where our story goes next. We have now followed Melrose through the acquisition of GKN, through the restructuring, and into its next phase as a focused aerospace company. What does Melrose look like now? Public ambitions for 2029. At the very top are Melrose's public ambitions. You can see it right here, right? By 2029, the company is targeting around $5 billion in revenue, more than $1.2 billion in adjusted operating profit, $600 million of free cash flow, and operating margins above 24%. Those are ambitious financial targets. But notice something important. The objective isn't simply to become larger. Melrose repeatedly talks about becoming a world-leading aerospace and defense business, delivering sustainable growth, strong margins, and superior cash flow. That tells us the transformation is no longer centered on restructuring. It's centered on long-term execution. How they're achieving it. The next question naturally becomes, how does management expect to reach those targets? The answer appears in the second section, factory consolidation. The answer appears in the second section, factory consolidation, restructuring and organizational simplification, productivity improvements, quality improvements, working capital optimization, program portfolio discipline, etc. And finally, the completion of the Dowlais separation. Notice the common theme. These are not headline-grabbing acquisitions. They're operational improvements. Melrose is now harvesting value from programs it already owns, rather than relying on entirely new ones. That represents a very different stage in the company's evolution. Where does the financial performance come from? We arrive at perhaps the most revealing numbers on the slide. Around 80% of adjusted operating profit comes from engine businesses. That single figure tells us where the economic center of gravity sits, not in the product launches, but in the mature engine programs, long-term risk and revenue sharing partnerships, aftermarket services, defense programs, and operational improvements. Those are businesses that create value over decades rather than quarters. The engine itself is only the beginning. Much of the long-term value comes after it enters service. Melrose's strategic partnerships. Companies such as Pratt & Whitney, GE Aerospace, Rolls-Royce, Airbus, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, BAE Systems, and several important defense partners, these relationships are fundamental to aerospace. Programs often last for decades, so success depends less on individual transactions and much more on long-term collaboration. At the same time, it is worth remembering that today's financial performance isn't being created by these partnerships alone. Much of it is being realized from investments made years ago, and aircraft fleets mature and aftermarket demands continue to grow. This is probably my favorite observation on the slide. Notice how closely the ambitions align with the execution strategy. Everything revolves around existing assets, existing aircraft platforms, existing engine programs, existing customer relationships, existing RRSP investments, and existing restructuring. This isn't a strategy based on constant reinvention. It's about extracting more value from an industrial platform that already exists. That's a very mature way of creating shareholder value. This panel right here summarizes the journey itself. First came the acquisition of GKN, then the removal of structural inefficiencies, improve profits, and become leaner and more focused. Sounds simple, but it's so far from being simple. The orange section right here, introduces an interesting discussion. Financial improvements were enabled through organizational simplification. Departments were removed. Programs consuming cash were discontinued. Some roles became redundant. Structures became leaner, or at least they were attempted to be leaner. All of those actions improved financial performance, but every optimization also introduces a trade-off. As organizations become leaner, institutional knowledge, cross-functional coordination, and internal capability can also become thinner if they are not deliberately managed. That's an important system perspective. Efficiency isn't simply about reducing cost. It's about preserving the organizational capability that creates value in the first place. Where Melrose invests its money. The capital expenditure numbers tell an interesting story. In 2024, Melrose invested approximately $123 million. In 2025, that reduced to around $94 million, despite strong financial performance. At first glance, that feels counterintuitive, but it actually tells us that the heavy transformation phase is largely complete. Capital expenditure now sits at roughly 0.9 times depreciation, meaning investment is focused primarily on maintaining and selectively strengthening existing capability rather than aggressively expanding capacity. Operating costs and investment priorities. Alongside the capital expenditure, you can see the operating costs and where the company spends its operating budget. Engineering, direct labor, supply chain, logistics, quality, R&D, maintenance, corporate functions. Running an aerospace enterprise of this scale costs several billion pounds every year. That means even small improvements in coordination can generate substantial financial impact. The investment priorities reinforce exactly that direction. Capacity expansion for upcoming production ramps, engine repair capability, digital manufacturing, additive manufacturing, automation, factory productivity, centers, defense production capability. These investments are all aimed at improving the performance of the existing industrial system. The final panel brings the entire slide together. Melrose is increasingly behaving less like a traditional industrial conglomerate and more like a focused aerospace technology company. Future growth is expected to come from mature engineering programs, aftermarket services, long-term partnerships, RRSP investments, and disciplined operational execution. In other words, strategy is no longer about building more factories, it's about making the existing enterprise work better. Looking at this slide as a whole, One conclusion stands out. The financial turnaround appears to have been successful, but the next challenge is different. It is sustaining that performance year after year. And that is where enterprise architecture and supply chain architecture becomes critical. Because once the restructuring is complete, competitive advantage no longer comes primarily from reducing cost. It comes from enabling engineering, manufacturing, supply chain finance, and program management to operate at one coordinated enterprise. That is the difference between completing a turnaround and building an organization that continues to outperform long after the turnaround is over. GKN Aerospace is a Tier 1 supplier in the aerospace industry. It employs around 16,000 people operating from more than 30 manufacturing sites across 12 countries. More importantly, its products fly on over 90% of the world's aircrafts. That's an extraordinary statistic. Most passengers will never hear the name GKN Aerospace, yet there is a very high probability they're flown on an aircraft containing GKN technology. The commercial aircraft programs, notice the breadth rather than the number. Airbus, Boeing, Embraer, and within each manufacturer, GKN participates across multiple aircraft families. A320neo, the A350, the 787 Dreamliner, the 777X. These aren't one-off contracts. Aircraft programs typically remain in production for decades, as we mentioned earlier. They require continuous engineering support, manufacturing, certification, upgrades, and product improvements throughout their life cycle. Now look at the engine programs. From a business perspective, this is arguably the most valuable part of the portfolio. GKN partners with Rolls-Royce, Pratt & Whitney, GE Aerospace, and CFM International on many of the world's leading engine programs. Several of these are risk and revenue sharing partnerships, the RRSP. That changes the relationship completely. GKN isn't simply supplying parts. GKN shares both the technical responsibility and the long-term commercial success of the program. As more engines enter service, the installed fleet grows, and with that comes decades of maintenance, repair, spare parts, and aftermarket revenue. Let's move down into defense right here. The F-35, Gripen, A400M, C-130 Hercules, NH-90. These programs often remain operational for 30, sometimes even 40 to 50 years, sometimes even maybe longer. And that creates exceptionally stable engineering partnerships built on certification, trust, and long-term performance. The portfolio doesn't stop with aircraft. On the right, you see rotorcraft. You see future vertical lift, Ariane launch vehicles, satellite structures, and rocket engine components. In other words, GKN Aerospace is participating not only in today's aviation industry, but also in the technologies shaping the future of flight and space. Finally, if you take a step back and look at the slide as a whole, this isn't a collection of independent programs, it's an interconnected network. GKN Aerospace works simultaneously with Airbus, Boeing, Rolls-Royce, Pratt & Whitney, GE Aerospace, Lockheed Martin, Leonardo, Saab, and many other OEMs. That makes it much more than a component manufacturer. It's a trusted engineering partner embedded across multiple industrial ecosystems at the same time. And that's why Melrose chose to keep this business. Factories can be built, machines can be purchased, but positions like this, you cannot just buy them with money. They are earned through decades of engineering capability, certification, delivery programs, and customer trust. Relationships that you have that has been built for over 200 years. In many ways, those long-term relationships are the company's greatest assets. And once you see GKN Aerospace through that lens, Melrose's decision becomes much easier to understand. They didn't simply acquire manufacturing capacity. They acquired a strategic position at the center of the global aerospace ecosystem.